Good morning. So tomorrow is Chav Cheshvan, the 165th birthday of the Rebbe Rashab, and we will begin tomorrow learning Ayin Beis. Samach Vav. After a good 13 years of Ayin Beis, so we made some announcements, and we'll make a few more today, and just to keep you updated. Meanwhile, I want whoever wants to join at the start of the Hemshech. I wanted to give them time, so I'm not going to discuss Samach Vav until tomorrow. But being that we are now literally in the beginning of the week of Parsha Chai Sarah, I thought I'd share a few words about this Parsha through the lens of Chassidus. As I said, tomorrow we'll start Samach Vav. Excuse me a second. So one of the big questions that people ask from the beginning of time, the search for the fountain of youth, immortality. The pharaohs of old, they thought perhaps they can gain eternal life through burying their live wives and families with them when they died in the pyramids. That didn't actually work out. Today we have the modern version of cryogenic freezing of DNA, people feeling that they can freeze it and one day be able to be resurrected. And then you have, of course, the whole pharmaceutical industry, in a way, is trying to some way impede aging, wrinkling, in the hope that a person can preserve their youthful features as long as possible. And that's a billion-dollar industry right there. So all of these attempts obviously will not be successful because, for a simple reason, the material world, by definition, matter, is subject to the elements of erosion, deterioration, aging, and then it perishes. It could change from matter to energy, but everything goes through those stages in life. That's what defines the material world. But in this week's Parsha, we actually have the secret to immortality. And it's based on the very name of the chapter, which is called Chayei Sarah. And Chayei Sarah means the life of Sarah. So you would think, as a headline goes, as the name of a product or name of a chapter, that this would be, if you read the life of Sarah, and I'm going to read about her life. But as soon as you read the first verse, you realize it's only half the sentence. It says, V'hi shnei Chayei Sarah, these are the years of the life of Sarah. She lived 127 years old, 127. And it talks actually about her passing. And then about Abraham seeking a burial plot for her, and finally buying something in Hebron, Ma'arat HaMachpelah, which till today remains the burial spot of Abraham, Sarah, and Abraham, and the other patriarchs and matriarchs. If you wanted to dedicate a chapter to Sarah's life, it would have been the previous chapter. So why would the Torah allow a name that seems to symbolize the exact opposite of her life? So years ago, a good story can help illuminate this. Around, I'd say at least 30 years ago, maybe more, I was invited to speak, Le'aleinu, no one should know of any passings or deaths, at a shloshim, 30 days after the passing of somebody. They lived in the Upper West Side. And they were driving me, and I was being driven up the Upper West Side. I was on the West Side Highway. And I was thinking about, what am I going to be saying here? And sometimes I just look out the window and look at the billboards, at the people. You get all kinds of ideas when you look around you. And suddenly a billboard jumped out at me. It was somewhere in the West Side Highway in the 50s or something like that. And there was a big billboard for Newport cigarettes, of all things, Newport cigarettes. The big, two beautiful faces of two young people, those beautiful faces, their skin glowing, the smile couldn't beat their smile. Whitest teeth you've ever seen. Remember, it's a billboard, so it's very large. And it says, alive with pleasure. And they're symbolizing life with pleasure, alive with pleasure. Then you have a little box of Newport cigarettes, and then the prerequisite legal disclaimer at the bottom of the left of the billboard in large letters that you can see it all the way on the highway. That smoking kills, dangerous for pregnant women. I don't remember exactly carbon monoxide. That bottom line, that this kills you, which of course is the paradox of our modern times. You could spend millions of dollars in advertising with a warning that something's going to kill you, but the picture of this couple and the way they're smiling and alive with pleasure, people seem to not notice the threat, the warning, and this sells cigarettes. And there I had my topic to speak about. It happened to be Parshat Chayei that week. So that's what I spoke about. I said, what is life? What defines life? What means alive with, not just alive, but with pleasure? So Madison Avenue, probably with plenty of photoshopping touch-ups, created this beautiful image. Everybody wants to look like this couple. Everybody wants to have such a smile and such glowing eyes. And white teeth like that, I don't even know if it exists. But definitely not smokers, definitely don't have such white teeth. And they're not showing you an x-ray of their lungs either. But the image, like the cynics at Madison Avenue say, it doesn't matter what happened, it matters what people think happened. Perception, what people perceive happened. So the image is so powerful. And this defines alive with pleasure. Basically very external, superficial. So in contrast, you have a chapter in the Torah, it's called The Life of Sarah, and it doesn't talk about her actual life, it talks about what happened after her life. Because that's exactly what the Torah is telling us. The Torah is telling us the secret to eternity. You want to know if someone's really alive? You don't look at them when they're walking and talking and influencing others. The day they're no longer physically here, you look at whether their spirit and their legacy and their values and what they stood for lives on. There are many people who had tremendous influence in this world, both for good and for bad. People who terrorized the universe, and while they were alive, they were like all powerful, and everybody was terrified of them. And yet, people couldn't wait till they'd be gone. And the day they did leave this earth, even if they may remember it in a bad way, but their memories, people want to erase. Nobody wants to remember these people. Then there are individuals who may not be such, who may be unsung heroes, and you may not see them in any spotlight or any fireworks or getting awards, but the legacy they leave, the spirit that they passed on, perpetuates to their children, their grandchildren, to eternity. So the Torah is telling you, want to know real life? Biological life, yes, ends when a person's heart stops or brain stops or however they measure it. The vital organs cease functioning. That's biological life. But true life is not biological. Biological life is just the technical part of it. True life is the influence, the impact you make, the fruits you bear. And when do you see that in a person's life, like with Sarah, the day after she's no longer here physically? The love of her husband, how he goes to lengths to find her a burial plot, respect with dignity, the effect on her son, Isaac Yitzchak, who later seeks in this same chapter, seeks out a wife, Rebecca, and they're looking for qualities. What kind of qualities? Most people don't necessarily want their mother's qualities. Here, the opposite. He's looking whether Rebecca reflects the same qualities that he saw in his mother, Sarah. And when he sees that, as we read later in the chapter, he saw it in three different ways. He saw that she had a candle that burned from Friday to Friday. She had a blessing in her dough, which means that kosher, but the way she prepared food, the way she presented it with a certain dignity and sanctity. And she finally, a cloud covered her tent, which reflects sexual and intimate purity. A person who was a healthy, innocent, and beautiful person inside and out. And where did he learn that from? From his mother. So when you see the impact of Sarah on her husband, on her child, I should say, but really her children, here I am talking about it 3,800 years later. It's literally 3,800 years. That's a long time. How many people can talk about someone so many years ago? That tells you that she's truly alive. And that's why the Talmud says that the wicked people, even in their lifetimes, they're called dead. And the righteous people, tzaddikim, tzidkanius, even in their deaths, they're called alive. Because as another place it says, just as his children or her children are alive, so too is he or she alive. So it's a whole other take on eternity. I must have mentioned this a number of times. I was once speaking at an event, academics, scientists, philosophers, thinkers. And in the middle of my talk, somewhere, I asked a question to the crowd. I said, does anyone know, well, before we get to anyone know, who would be considered the greatest Western philosopher? So most people will say Aristotle. What about the greatest Western writer? English writer, Shakespeare. What about artists? Say you have Rembrandt, Van Gogh, you have the different masters. Music, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart. I'm not getting into, you could have different opinions on this matter. I said, does anyone know in this room whether Aristotle had any children? Or for that matter, Shakespeare, or Mozart, or Rembrandt, or many of the other great thinkers, artists throughout history. And I remember a few people began to look at their phones. They Googled it. And I said, hey, you guys are PhDs, you're Googling this? Anyway, after the amusing laughter, the fact is most people didn't know. And even if they did, what about grandchildren? What about great-grandchildren? So here's the question. These are men and women, for that matter, in history, that left great legacies. Books, ideas, writings, drawings. And yet, they did not leave a family to perpetuate whatever it was that they left. They definitely did not leave a community. They didn't create a movement. Avram Avinu, by contrast, Abraham and Sarah, were maybe as great philosophers as all of them, and pioneers for that matter, pioneering monotheism, pioneering social justice, pioneering human rights. These are the things that Abraham and Sarah championed and advocated and inspired so many people with, that till this day, the values that we cherish all originate from those ideas, like we read in in Shabbos' chapter, last week's chapter, about Yedu, where God speaks about Avram Avinu, a person who Yedu Shamru Derech Hashem Lasis Daka Mishpat, a person who dedicated his life and his family and his community and for generations to come till this day to do tzedakah and mishpat, justice, virtue, kindness. So with all his great accomplishments, The greatest was Abraham left an eternal legacy. And this is really the secret of the Jewish people. It wasn't enough to have good ideas, beautiful ideas, revolutionary ideas, and even leave books and writings and teachings and so on, but to build a living legacy, people, a family that follows this, a community. One of the theories why they didn't put so much focus on family, because they were busy with their philosophies. They say Rousseau, one of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, had a family, a bunch of children. He did have children, but he gave them away to the public. He brought them to the public square and said, I'm too busy philosophizing, pontificating for a family. A family can be, for someone of that nature, a creative person, a nuisance. The diaper children, people are nervous. We all know what it is, the difficulty of bringing up kids. So someone who thinks he's a genius, was God's gift to this world, has no time for family and children. But in Judaism, it was the exact opposite. If it's a value worth living by, then the first place you want to see it expressed is in your family, your children. So what I shared, it was received respectfully, but it wasn't everybody, not everybody in that room of academics was so happy to hear that, because it's not something you really hear about in the universities. Getting back to our discussion, so the true eternity of a life is when you see what happens after the person has passed. And in this case, Chaya Sarah, where she will come alive, when you see the effect on those around her. And not just then, but generations to come till this very day. So it's interesting. In this world, we value instant gratification. We value things that make immediate impact. The long-term, things that really last for a long time, most of us will not be here to see those fruits. So we focus on what we can do right now or we accomplish. I said instant gratification. I think studies show that if somebody asks you, would you like to have $10,000 right now or $50,000 over the next 10 years, most people would ask for the $10,000 because they don't know what's going to be in 10 years from now and who knows what will happen and so on. Because there's something about the immediate, going back to the pharmaceutical industry, the cosmetics industry, the beauty industry, fashion industry. These are all focused on the here and now. I'm not saying a person shouldn't look beautiful, but it does not focus on the eternal. And in Judaism, Chaya Sarah, the emphasis is not just on temporary, but on the permanent. And the Talmud already bemoans the fact by saying, people will choose Chaya Shah over Chaya Elam, the life of the moment over the life of forever. If something is pleasant now, pleasurable now, we don't think about consequences too much. And that's why it's not so easy to hold on to something in that way. The discipline necessary means you're thinking ahead, you're thinking the big picture, you're thinking about the future. So that's my first initial thought about Chaya Sarah that I wanted to share. As I said, this is all, we're transitioning from this, we're going to go into Samach Vav tomorrow, which of course teaches us the secret of eternity in more detail, the formula. I wanted to begin by sharing a few things of this week's Parsha. I'll say some more, but let me stop here if anybody wants to comment or ask anything. We're all good? Okay. So with that, let me share a few other thoughts then. One of the questions that's asked is why Abraham insisted on purchasing, he wanted to purchase what was called then Kiras Arba, which was the Ma'aras HaMachpelah that he used for the burial spot for Sarah. And then later he himself was also buried there, and same with Isaac and Rebekah, and later Jacob and Leah. And we know tradition tells us also Adam and Eve are there. So if you've ever been to Hebron, it's a sacred spot, not just for Jews and a lot of Muslims, because they see Abraham as their ancestor as well. But the question is, he was ready to give it to him as a gift. Why the need for him purchasing it? And one of the reasons is because Abraham wanted to make sure that this will remain forever, again, eternity, a forever property of his and his children. If it's given as a gift, so halachically, as well as in many legal systems, a gift can also be rescinded. Whereas when you purchase something and you get a deed, considered to be the most permanent way of passing on property. And that's what Avraham Avinu wanted. The Rebbe would cite this quite a few times in context of Israel, when people argue whether, like what it says in the first Rashi in Chumash, that the nations of the world are going to come and say that the Jews are thieves. They stole this land. They have documentation in the Torah. Firstly, that God gave us this land, the promised land, as promised in the chapter Lech Lecha. You see that explicitly written. But furthermore, that Abraham didn't just rely on the promise, he also went ahead and purchased land to make sure that it's permanent. Matter of fact, Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, I'm sure if you've ever been to Jerusalem, there's the Tzemach Tzedek Shul. What the history behind that is, and it's on Rechov Chabad Street, right there in the middle of the old city. Because at Tzemach Tzedek, as you know, the Alter Rebbe had sent some of his Chassidim, some of his students, to Israel. And the same thing, the Mittler Rebbe sent some of his family. And the Tzemach Tzedek cemented it by actually purchasing land. I believe maybe the Mittler Rebbe also may have purchased land. I have to check on that. So they actually purchased land. We're talking now in the 18th century. In Hebron, in Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem went through exchange of hands quite a few times since the 18th century. The Ottomans controlled it, then the British, and then, of course, the Jordanians, it was Palestine before 1948. It was in 1967 when the old city was liberated again. But till 1967, it was not in the hands of the Jews. But the shul was still there. And it was a whole fight, a legal fight, but they had documents that it was a Tzemach Tzedek shul. He bought it. He had a deed. But it's a deed from the 18th century. The same thing in Hebron. I think there's still some disputes about it. I'm not sure all the details. But the point is, Avraham Avinu was wise enough, again, almost 4 millennia ago, almost 4,000 years ago, to purchase land. And there is actually, I saw different documents of those that want to reappropriate and reclaim land that was confiscated. How did Israel suddenly become in the control of the Romans? Or later the Byzantines, the church? It was all stolen. It was stolen or through war or through pillaging. It was all illegal. The question is, how much can you enforce from back then from modern day law? But I've seen documents that people are actually want to sue and prove with different documentation of how the land was taken away from the Jewish people. So it's true, we were exiled, Babylon, first by the Babylonians, later the Romans. But still, being exiled doesn't mean that you don't own the property. Anyway, just interesting historical notes on this topic. And the more archaeologists dig up in Israel and Jerusalem and other places, the more obviously others don't like it, because it proves the historical connection, the historical link between the Jewish people and Israel, especially in Jerusalem and other major cities like that. And all begins again this week's chapter, where Avraham actually buys this plot of land that till today is in Hebron. And that too is quite aggravating, because for different reasons, the Israeli government doesn't want to provoke. So parts of it is under the control of Muslims, part of it under the control of Jews. If you ever go there, you see there are places they don't let you visit, even though it's the burial space of our great patriarchs and matriarchs. So that's just another element in this week's chapter that talks about eternity, connected to modern day history and events going on right now as we speak. And I thought also interesting. Additionally, another verse I want to talk about But let me stop again if anybody wants to comment or ask anything. Okay. Later in the chapter, there's a verse that says, Va'avram zoken ba bayamim. That Abraham aged, this is after Sarah's passing, of course. Abraham aged, Zokan, Avram Zokan, ba bayamim, came into his days. So a question is asked by the Zohar, what's the redundancy? Once it says he's aged, what does it mean? Ba bayamim. He came into his days. And the Zohar answers, ba bayamim shleimin. He didn't just age, he came with full, complete days. And we all know there's a thing called wasting time. You can age, have many years behind you, many days behind you, but were those days filled days? Were they filled with content, with spirit, with meaning? Or, like the Maral's brother has a sefer, and he says, people cry over the loss of money, but they don't cry over the loss of time. Whereas loss of money, you could always make money again. Time, you cannot reclaim the time that was the past. So in Chassidus especially focuses on the Zohar to explain how time is energy. And every second in time is like a life. You're given a life. And how are you going to use that moment? And how are you going to use that day? If you use it productively, by helping someone, by connecting to God, to Hashem, learning Torah, doing a mitzvah. So then you've tapped into the energy of that day and you've actualized it. So the day comes alive and forever is a day that will live on, even though it was just one day or one moment. It lives on to eternity because you did something eternal in that moment. However, God forbid, when a person wastes a moment or wastes a day, so then the day is like the life that you were given is no longer alive. You were given a life, an energy flow, and was not utilized. I have a chapter in my book called A Day of Life, in Torah Meaningful Life, end of first section, where I speak a lot about this topic. And I want to share a few points that I cite there about this. There was once the Rebbe's secretary came to the Rebbe's room, and the Rebbe asked him, what time is Ma'ariv? What time are they going to daven Ma'ariv? So he said 9:15, 9:30. And the Rebbe said 9:15 and 9:30. He says, it's only 15 minutes, he tells the Rebbe, the secretary. The Rebbe says, you know what you can accomplish in 15 minutes? So it brings to mind, in 1970, was 20 years from when the Rebbe assumed leadership. That year, based on an inspiration coming from Israel, the Rebbe agreed to conclude what was called Mashiach Sefer Torah. What does that mean? The Frierdiker Rebbe, during World War II, began writing a Sefer Torah that he called Mashiach Sefer Torah. That we will march out of Golus with this Torah with Mashiach. But he never finished the Torah. They began writing it, they didn't finish it. So in 1970, in honor of Yud Shvat, 20th anniversary of the 10th of Shvat, the Rebbe said, let's finish the Sefer Torah. Again, based on inspiration that came from Israel. So the first few weeks, it was very secret. The Rebbe called in the scribe, who was going to finish the Torah, called in a few of the activists. And it was planned. That year, Yud Shvat was Friday. So it was a Farbrengen on that Friday. Friday afternoon, there was a Farbrengen, a short Farbrengen, not long, but there are pictures of it, where the Sefer Torah is concluded. You could see the Rebbe carrying the Sefer Torah. Everyone thought, I was bar mitzvah that year, actually. We all thought Mashiach was coming on that Friday. It was like, we dressed our best. We dressed in Shabbos clothing. I remember went to the Farbrengen. It was amazing. But the main point I want to make here, relevant to us, is something that happened 10 days later. So there were many guests that came for that Yud Shvat, because it was like, besides the 20th year, it was also the Sefer Torah. And many guests from Israel, from other countries, England. They stayed, many of them stayed for 10 days. And the 20th of Shvat, which I believe could be a Sunday, if 10th of was on a Friday, maybe it wasn't a Sunday, not necessarily. No, it wouldn't be. 10th, the 17th, 18th, 19th, maybe Monday. Anyway, there's a Farbrengen at Seischem L'Shalom. Rabbi had a Farbrengen that he was going to basically, in honor of the guests that were leaving back to their respective locations. And the Farbrengen was, again, early afternoon. And sometime middle of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe says the following. He says he's noticing that some of the guests are looking at the clock, whether they're going to make it in time for their flights, because their flights were later in the afternoon that day. And the Rebbe said, remember that God creates the world every minute, every second anew. Every second's a new world. So right now, the JFK and the plane and your flight has not been renewed yet. Still has to be renewed. So we have a new world, many times to renew till you get to that point. And what you have to focus on is where we are right now in a Farbrengen, not looking at the clock, what's going to happen later. And he told the story. He said that when he was clearly a young man by the Frierdiker Rebbe, the year was, I think, 1926 or 1927. So we're talking about the Rebbe being born 1902, 25 years old. And the Rebbe says, I went in, my father-in-law was in Leningrad at the time, and I went into his room, and he was preparing, he had to go in a few minutes, for the next 15 or 20 minutes, on a very dangerous and secret trip to Moscow. There was going to be a meeting there, but they were watching him then already, and they were going, remember, he was arrested in 1927. This is either that year or a year before, something approximately that time. And he said that, so it was a very dangerous trip because there were spies, and then they could arrest you like that for any given reason or no reason. And he says, I walked in, and my shver, my father-in-law, was sitting at the table and reading something as if no worries in the world. You know, usually someone's going on a trip, especially a dangerous trip, in the next few minutes, they're packing, they're finishing things, they're preparing. He was sitting as if nothing's happening, completely calm, relaxed, as if he's going to be sitting there for the next hours on end. And the Rebbe said these words, that he could not, he was so taken by that. So he says to his father-in-law, his future father-in-law, he wasn't married yet, the Rebbe, till 1929, at 28, end of 28. The Rebbe says to his father-in-law, Moyach Shalt Alev, aber ad kedei kach. Moyach Shalt Alev means self-mastery, the mind over the heart. So the Rebbe said, I understand there's an element of Moyach Shalt Alev, of self-control, but to such an extent? Meaning he was asking the Frierdiker Rebbe, how does he have the ability to have that composure and not be distracted and just completely focused on the moment, even though he's about to go on a very, very dangerous trip? And the Frierdiker Rebbe responded to him that my father taught me the secret of hatzlacha in zman, success in time, with time. So I asked him, what's hatzlacha in zman? It's not clear from the Rebbe whether the Rebbe asked the Frierdiker Rebbe or the Frierdiker Rebbe asked his father, the Rebbe Rashab. But regardless, the question was, what's hatzlacha in zman? So he said, hatzlacha in zman, hatzlacha in time, means that you're able to be focused completely at a given moment and do everything you need to do then, as if there's no yesterday and no tomorrow. There's no past, no future. Complete focus. And he told him the story of the Rashba. The Rashba was one of the great Rishonim in the 12th century, I believe. And He said the Rashba was a very busy man, where he spent, of course, hours studying every day, another few hours responsa that he would write answers to people's questions that they would submit. A third thing, he was a Rav, so he led a community. He taught, and he still had time every day to go for a walk. So the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe, that's Hatzlacha in Zman. How could you do so much? Because whatever he did, he was completely focused, not distracted, not 20%, not 90% attention, full attention. Like it says in other places that a pnimi, what he's doing entirely. The Rebbe didn't bring this then, but there's a similar story when the Rebbe Rashab was once about to say a Maimer Chassidus. So the Bochrim, who sensed that a Maimer is coming, they sang the song faster than usual because they were so excited, they were anticipating, they wanted to hear the Maimer Chassidus already. So they began singing quicker. And the Rebbe Rashab, he sensed that, and he stopped them and gave a whole talk about how when you're in a certain place, you have to do it completely, even though the song is only a hachana, only a preparation for the mimer. So you'd say, what's the big thing? It's only a preparation. It's not the main show, so to speak. But when in Kedusha and holiness, whatever you do, even if it's a preparation for something else, you have to do it as if it's completely dedicated to that activity at that moment. And then when it comes the next step. And the Rebbe brings off in the Ragat Shover that even walking to the Mizbeach, to the altar in the Beis HaMikdash, even though walking was only a preparatory stage in order to spray the blood of the offerings, but it's still considered an Aveda, because in the Kedusha and holiness, even when you walk towards something, the walking itself becomes divine service. It's a very powerful concept. So the Rebbe spoke, that's what he said. So right now everybody should be focused on the Farbrengen here. We're sitting together, Chassidim, not to look at the watch, what's going to be soon. Complete focus, Hatzlacha in Zman. It's a tremendous lesson going back to from Zokan, Baba Yomim, to come with full days. For a person to have that type of focus, that laser focus, where you are completely. Not so difficult, not so easy. You see many of us, you're doing something, get distracted, someone calls you, your phone, you're this, you're that. But that ability to be completely there, as if nothing else is happening in the world, is quite a feat. Now, not all of us can necessarily reach that level of discipline, but it's something to aspire to, and I thought a tremendous lesson in the Avram Zokan Baba Yomim idea of using time to its fullest. And time, as I said again, is energy. So when you use it, the day itself becomes full. Not just a day that passed and you happen to do something or not do something that day, but the day itself becomes alive. Okay. Let me pause again for any questions or comments. Well, everybody's so quiet today. Fine. So let's move on. Next theme in this week's chapter. You have then, it talks about that. Of course, the story with Yitzchak and Rivka, I mentioned that earlier, that they marry, and Rivka lives up to the spirit and the legacy of her mother-in-law, great mother-in-law Sarah, and Yitzchak sees that, and that's what he so admires. Then you have another chapter that talks about, in this week's chapter, in this week's Pasha, that talks about, it's more of a cryptic section that's less discussed, but it says that afterwards, Abraham went back to Keturah and had children with her. So there's more children that Abraham had. Keturah, Rashi and the commentaries say, is Hagar. So Hagar, the one that Abraham had initially Yishmael with, now he has more children with. And the Torah says that Abraham sent them off to the east. And Rashi brings from Medrash that he sent them with names, sacred names, but impure sacred names. What does that mean? Names that can be used for inappropriate reasons, holy names. like when you talk about witchcraft or black magic or other things like that. But he sent them with names. Now, some attribute this to the birth of Buddhism in the Far East. And when you see words like Brahmin, I've even seen a book that describes all kinds of Buddhist terms using Abrahamic Brahmin, like Brahmin is from Abraham. Things that can be traced to Abraham. So it's not surprising, as I said, there are some books that posit this theory that the reason there are so many parallels and similarities between Far East mysticism, including Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism and so on, to some of the mystical teachings in Kabbalah, is because it actually originates from the same source. Because Abraham sent his children with these teachings, the mystical teachings. Some attribute to Abraham the book of formation, Sefer Yetzirah, considered one of the first, maybe the first or one of the first. Some say Raziel HaMalach is attributed to Adam. It's also a Kabbalistic work. But Sefer Yetzirah, and there's an excellent translation from Aryeh Kaplan on the book of formation, Sefer Yetzirah, where he presents all these theories, ideas of, theories, all these different opinions about who authored Sefer Yetzirah. So Abraham was an author of a Kabbalistic work that is cited to this day in Kabbalah and Chassidus. So it's not surprising that Abraham's children would have been familiar with and would have grown up with mystical teachings. It's not spoken about directly in the written Torah, but it's definitely hinted and alluded to, which adds a whole other element to the globalization of the teachings of Abraham, because it's not just the children of Abraham, as in Yishmael, who would become the ancestor of the Arab Muslim world, Arab and then Muslim, later Muslim world, and then the father of Yitzchak, of course, of the Jewish people, ancestor. Yitzchak, in turn, father of Esav, ancestor of the Rome, Western Christian world, Edom, Malchus Edom. And of course, Jacob continuing the lineage of Yitzchak. So it adds now, what about the East? So based on this fact that Abraham sent his children to the East, you can make the case that the teachings of Abraham also reached the East. But there's a lot of discussion about this, how the population grew from a Jewish perspective, the migration and how the growth of population growth. According to the Bible, according to the Torah, everything begins in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and then they're expelled from there, and that's basically modern-day southeastern Iraq. So based on the biblical narrative, of course there's the flood, but basically they began to migrate from there. Avram Avinu, we know, goes up the Euphrates River, follows it, which goes northwest, all the way through Syria to Israel. And that's where what we call the Mesopotamian Valley, which is for many the cradle of civilization, and especially near the rivers and the waters, because it was an agricultural society. That's how they sustained themselves. So bottom line is that spread outwards. Now the question really is, I don't really want to go into it right now. The three children, Shem, Cham, and Yafes of Noah, where did they end up? So again, Aryeh Kaplan has an excellent translation of the Torah as well, called the Living Torah. And there he cites where the different opinions of where Shem, of course, is the Semites. That's why it's called Semite. We're called Semites, like anti-Semite is from the word Shem. Shem was the grandfather of Abraham. And Cham and Yafes, some say Cham ended up in Africa, and Yafes would be more, and that's where the discussion is. Some say to the east, all the way to China, and some say to Europe. So it's not so clear exactly how it worked, but there's also obviously plenty of intermarriage and interbreeding, so we don't really have answers to all of that. But from a Jewish point of view, Abraham went ultimately in Israel, had his son Yitzchak. Yishmael would end up being in the land that would ultimately become the Arab kingdoms, the Arab nations, and then later Muslims, some of them. And to the east, he sent his children. That would be to the Far East, would be probably India and the countries around there. So that's just another interesting twist in this week's chapter that can be discussed. As I said, there's some good books on this topic that I've seen. They do good research and bring many different opinions. And that touches that point. Okay. And then finally, the end of the story of Chayei Sarah is Yishmael returns. Abraham passes away in this week's chapter. And Yishmael returns to help bury his father. And you see here that Rashi says he does tshuva because he defers to Yitzchak. You could see the respect, mutual respect. So Yishmael ends up coming back to his roots with Abraham, and it seems like there's a reconciliation between Yishmael and Yitzchak. It's not 100% clear exactly the level of it, but clearly there was definitely a reconciliation. As I said, Rashi says he did tshuva. So bottom line is, if you look at the end of Chayei Sarah, the final Baal HaTurim says something interesting. After Yishmael does tshuva, it says, let me pull it up because interesting quote. I want to quote it literally. 1 second. Do I have the Baal HaTurim here altogether? I think so. 1 second. Yeah, here we go. So the Baal HaTurim, at the end of this week's chapter, the last verse, so it talks about, let me just see, it talks about the children of Yishmael, right, in detail, and then where they lived, and then it talks about Yishmael himself, that he lived 137 years, passes away, and then the last words are Pnei kol echav nofal. So the Baal HaTurim says that the next verse after that is Ela Teldus Yitzchak. So he says like this: Kishiyipel Yishmael, when Yishmael will fall, ba'achris hayomim, at the end of days, Oz Yitzmach ben David. Then the house of David, children of David, Mashiach will rise, will sprout. Shehu Meteldus Yitzchak. He's from the children of Yitzchak. So the connection is Apnei kol echav nofal, the end of days. It's referring to the end of days when Yishmael will fall, and then from the children of Yitzchak will come Mashiach. That's the last of the Baal HaTurim on this week's chapter. So I thought that's an appropriate conclusion to our discussion here. And I will stop here and take any questions if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay. So this is very consistent with the Zohar that we discussed a few weeks ago. The Zohar, in the note that the Rebbe wrote, that the Rebbe answered to Rabbi Greenglass about Avram praying for Yishmael, even though he knew what Yishmael would do at the end of days. And the Zohar talks about how Yishmael would attack other nations, including Israel. And now you have the end of the story is when we will prevail. So this literally is like a prophecy of events, hopefully, that are coming to a conclusion in Gaza and in the Middle East in general, where Yishmael, the enemy, as the enemy, will fall, and they'll be transformed to allies, and Mashiach will arrive. Okay. And there you go. Any questions, comments, anything?
remember you actually interpret the names of sons of Ishmael according to their destiny. Do you remember this wonderful work that you did?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I remember doing something. I don't remember now the details. I remember something, yeah.
We can you recover this particular work? You did a great job about that.
I'd have to look. Yeah, I would use some AI to maybe find it.
Thank you.
It was for sure me, not my brother. I will look it up. Okay. So with that, we'll come to a conclusion of this class. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop here. As I said, tomorrow we will begin, please God, Ayin Beis. I keep saying Ayin Beis. Sorry.